I came home early, and froze. My wife was there, but what I saw changed everything. It's concise, suspenseful, and taps into shock, curiosity, and emotional stakes, perfect for a slow-burn romance with tension. The evening felt ordinary at first. I had just finished work, the weight of deadlines still pressing on my shoulders, when I decided to come home a little earlier than usual. There was a quiet comfort in routine, the familiar hum of the air conditioner, the faint scent of coffee lingering from the morning. But the moment I stepped through the front door, everything felt off. At first, it was subtle. The faint click of the lock, the unusual stillness in the living room, the soft rustle of fabric from the other room. My heart, for reasons I didn't yet understand, started to race. Something was out of place. I called her name softly, almost hesitantly, and heard only the echo of my own voice. Then I saw her. My wife, elegant, poised, and undeniably graceful even in casual home clothes, was caught in a position I couldn't immediately understand. She froze, mid-motion, legs perched in a way that made my stomach drop. For a moment, the world narrowed to that single image, her startled eyes meeting mine, a flicker of guilt, or was it fear? Crossing her face. Time slowed. I noticed the subtle details I had never truly seen before, the curve of her neck as she turned, the gentle sway of her hair, the faint perfume she always wore that now seemed almost intoxicating in this tense moment. My mind raced with questions, yet there was a strange, almost magnetic pull toward her. She had always commanded attention effortlessly, but now that power felt vulnerable, fragile. I froze in the doorway, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. The floor beneath my feet creaked slightly, a sound that somehow magnified the tension in the room. Her hand brushed lightly against the edge of the furniture, an almost imperceptible gesture that betrayed her composure. The quiet hum of the house, usually comforting, now seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. Every instinct in me screamed betrayal. Yet, alongside the shock, there was something else, an involuntary awareness of her presence, her grace, the subtle rhythm of her movements. I realized, in that suspended moment, that I didn't fully understand her world, her emotions, or the layers of her life I had taken for granted. I wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but the words stuck in my throat. My pulse thudded loudly in my ears, my senses hyper-aware of every detail, the faint scent of her perfume, the way the evening light spilled across the living room, casting shadows that seemed to stretch between us. I was caught between disbelief, fear, and an undeniable fascination. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, she shifted, her eyes meeting mine fully now, and the air between us thickened with tension, a silent question hanging, what do we do now? That single moment, this delicate balance of shock, curiosity, and something inexplicably intimate, set the stage for everything that would follow. The story, I realized, was far more complex than I could have imagined. And my life, as I thought I knew it, was about to change forever. This version focuses on shock, sensory detail, and subtle emotional tension, establishing a compelling slow-burn hook for viewers while remaining YouTube safe. If you want, I can also expand part 2, the confrontation next, keeping the story flowing naturally with rising tension. Do you want me to do that? I stood in the doorway, frozen, my mind trying to catch up with what my eyes had just seen. The initial shock had started to fade, replaced by a swirling mix of confusion, hurt, and a reluctant curiosity. I wanted to yell, to demand an explanation, but something in her gaze made me pause. It wasn't just fear or guilt, I sensed a quiet, fragile composure beneath the tension, and that made the confrontation far more complicated than I expected. Why? My voice was barely more than a whisper, rough with emotion. I could feel my throat tighten, my chest heavy, and my pulse throbbing in my ears. She didn't immediately answer. Instead, she shifted slightly, the soft brush of her hand against the furniture drawing my attention in a way I didn't anticipate. Her movements were graceful, deliberate, almost like she was trying to control the fragile tension in the room. Her eyes met mine fully this time, and for a brief moment, the world outside the walls of our living room didn't exist. There was a quiet understanding in that look, a mix of vulnerability and strength. She opened her mouth, and then paused, as if weighing each word carefully. That hesitation spoke volumes. She wasn't trying to deceive me, not entirely. She was trying to explain something complicated, something that needed patience more than judgment. I stepped in, slowly, my hands unconsciously tensing at my sides. The air felt thick between us, charged with unspoken emotions. I noticed every small detail, the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her hair fell over her shoulder, the subtle lines of tension in her jaw. These were not the gestures of someone careless, they were the signs of someone deeply aware of the consequences of this moment. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft, yet steady, carrying the weight of honesty. "I didn't expect you to come home so early," she said, almost like an apology, almost like a warning. The words themselves weren't shocking, but the way they landed in the room made me pause. There was an explanation here, one that I hadn't anticipated, and yet the sting of betrayal still lingered. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. I don't understand. My words faltered, because even as anger surged through me, there was a pull toward her that I couldn't ignore. Her presence was magnetic, her vulnerability disarming, and it made me realize that my reaction wasn't purely about what I thought I saw. It was about years of shared history, the comfort we had built, and the sudden fear of losing it. We stood there, in silence for a long moment, measuring each other, reading every subtle gesture, the way her shoulders curved forward slightly, the tilt of her head, the catch in her breath. Our confrontation wasn't loud or explosive, it was quiet, tense, and intimate. Every glance, every pause, carried the weight of unspoken questions, lingering touches, and complicated emotions. In that charged silence, I realized that this moment, this confrontation, wasn't just about what had happened. It was about the unspoken truths between us, the cracks in our understanding, and the vulnerability we both had to face. And as I looked at her, poised yet uncertain, I knew that how we navigated this confrontation would define the story of us from this point forward. This expanded version focuses on internal conflict, body language, and subtle emotional tension, keeping viewers immersed while setting up the slow-burn narrative for Part 3. If you want, I can continue with Keynote 3, Confessions Begin, keeping the emotional tension and intimacy growing naturally. Do you want me to do that next? After that tense silence, something shifted in the room. I could feel it, not in words, but in the air between us. She sat down slowly on the edge of the couch, her posture slightly guarded, shoulders curved inward as if she were bracing herself for impact. I remained standing, unsure whether to move closer or give her space, my heart caught somewhere between anger, fear, and an unexplainable pull toward her. I need to tell you the truth, she said, her voice low but steady, tinged with a vulnerability I had rarely seen. She didn't reach out immediately, but I noticed her hands resting on her lap, fingers gently tracing invisible patterns, a nervous habit she probably didn't even realize she had. It was human, fragile, and somehow more intimate than any grand gesture could be. I sat down across from her, keeping a small, respectful distance, but close enough that our knees almost brushed. That proximity, accidental or not, sent a quiet jolt through me. Our eyes met, lingering just a fraction longer than necessary, and for a moment, the tension between us was tangible, a silent acknowledgement of years of connection, shared history, and unspoken desires. She began to speak, slowly, carefully. Not the kind of confession I had feared in my worst imaginings, but a complex truth that demanded patience to understand. I listened, every word weighted, as she revealed the pressures, the loneliness, the subtle misunderstandings that had built over time. Her hands occasionally shifted, brushing her hair behind her ear or resting lightly against her own arm, gestures that somehow made her vulnerability even more striking. I realized then that my initial shock had been only a surface reaction. The situation wasn't simply what it had appeared, it was layered, nuanced, human. She was not the villain of the story, she was a woman navigating her own complexities, just as I was learning to navigate mine. And yet, the hurt was still there, threading through my chest, reminding me that trust isn't rebuilt in a single conversation. There were moments when words weren't enough. A sigh here, a pause there, the way she avoided looking at me for a heartbeat before meeting my gaze again, these silences spoke volumes. I noticed the subtle warmth radiating from her as she leaned slightly forward, a small, almost imperceptible invitation for connection, even in the midst of tension. It made me acutely aware of my own reactions, the tightness in my chest, the way my hands rested tensely on my knees, the pull toward closing the gap between us. For the first time since walking in, I felt a glimmer of understanding. It wasn't about excusing mistakes or ignoring hurt, it was about seeing her fully, beyond the image of betrayal, beyond my initial shock. And in that understanding, there was a strange, delicate intimacy forming, a connection forged not by passion, but by honesty, vulnerability, and the quiet acknowledgement that we were navigating something profound together. By the end of the conversation, I realized something essential: the story of us wasn't over. It had changed, yes, complicated and fragile, but it was still ours. And as I looked at her, her eyes reflecting a mix of relief, fear, and hope, I felt a tentative shift, the beginning of a bridge that could reconnect us, built slowly, carefully, and with every word spoken from the heart. This expanded keynote emphasizes emotional honesty, subtle physical cues, and the beginning of deep connection, keeping the slow burn tension alive and setting up Part 4, Re-examining Trust. I can continue with Keynote 4 next, where the emotional stakes rise and internal conflict deepens. Do you want me to do that? After our first honest conversation, the house felt different, quieter, almost suspended in time. I retreated to the kitchen, pretending to busy myself with the mundane act of pouring water, but my mind was anything but idle. Every detail of the earlier moments played over in my head, the way she had avoided my gaze for a fraction of a second, the tremor in her fingers as she confessed, the subtle tension that lingered even in her attempts to appear composed. I sat down at the kitchen table, leaning back, letting the weight of conflicting emotions settle on me. Betrayal, yes, but also a curious pull, an unexplainable need to understand her completely, to see beyond the moment that had so startled me. I recalled the small gestures we had shared over the years, her hand briefly brushing mine while reaching for something, the warmth of her shoulder against me during quiet evenings, the laughter we shared over inconsequential things. Those memories, suddenly vivid, clashed sharply with the sting of mistrust, creating a swirl of emotion that I could neither ignore nor resolve immediately. My thoughts drifted further back, replaying subtle signs I had missed. The quiet sighs in the mornings, the distant expression she sometimes wore when I assumed she was tired, the way she lingered on her phone longer than usual. None of these were proof of anything, but they took on new weight in light of what I had witnessed. I realized that trust isn't simply given, it's constantly built, challenged, and rebuilt. And right now, that process had hit a critical point. I found myself examining my own reactions. Why did my chest tighten so painfully at the thought of her vulnerability? Why did the accidental brush of her hand feel electric, even amid uncertainty? There was a tension here, more subtle than anger, more persistent than fear, the magnetic pull between us, the silent acknowledgement that what we shared could not be undone by a single mistake or misstep. I decided to confront my feelings honestly, even if only within my own mind. The anger that had flared initially was intertwined with admiration for her composure, for her courage in facing me with the truth. And somewhere in that mix, a quiet longing emerged, a realization that our connection ran deeper than the events of a single afternoon. Later, when she emerged to sit across from me again, the air was thick with unspoken tension. We didn't speak at first, words weren't needed. I noticed her subtle cues, the way her foot tapped lightly against the floor, the slight tilt of her head, the warmth radiating from her presence. Even in silence, there was intimacy, shared space, shared history, and a tentative willingness to rebuild what had been fractured. By the time evening settled fully, I understood that this period of reflection wasn't just about mistrust, it was about awareness. About seeing her fully, seeing myself fully, and acknowledging the depth of connection we had cultivated over the years. Trust, I realized, would not return instantly. But the willingness to examine it, to confront discomfort and vulnerability, was the first step toward healing. And in that quiet, reflective moment, I felt the slow, careful stirrings of hope, that we might navigate this together, carefully, honestly, and with the subtle intimacy that only comes from truly seeing one another. This version emphasizes internal struggle, reflection on past connection, and subtle physical/emotional intimacy, keeping the slow burn tension alive and naturally leading into Part 5, Heart to Heart. I can continue with Keynote 5, Heart to Heart next, where the emotional peak begins. Do you want me to do that? The night had settled in, casting a soft amber glow across the living room. Outside, the world was quiet, the occasional hum of distant traffic or a breeze rustling through trees the only sounds breaking the stillness. We sat across from each other, a careful space between us, yet it felt charged with unspoken words, with all the tension, longing, and vulnerability that had been building over the past hours. She reached for a throw pillow, hugging it lightly to her chest, her fingers brushing the fabric as if grounding herself. I noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way she kept her gaze flicking between my eyes and the floor. There was hesitancy in her movements, a delicate acknowledgement of the fragility in the moment. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Words felt too heavy, too final, too easily misinterpreted. And yet, the silence itself carried meaning. We were both waiting, willing each other to take the first step toward honesty. Finally, I broke the quiet. I want to understand, I said softly, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. I need to. There was a pause, the kind that stretches and thickens, before she slowly nodded. Her hand, almost imperceptibly, moved closer to mine on the couch's edge. I felt the warmth radiating from her fingertips, a subtle, grounding reassurance. I've made mistakes, she began, her voice low, tinged with regret, yet steady. But not everything is as it seemed. I didn't mean to hurt you. Her words faltered, and I noticed the catch in her breath, the gentle trembling of her fingers. I reached out slowly, letting my hand hover just above hers, giving her the choice to meet my touch. When she finally placed her hand in mine, the connection was electric in its simplicity, a handhold, but charged with years of intimacy, trust, and unspoken longing. We spoke then, honestly, deeply, without exaggeration or performance. Each confession was met with careful listening, each vulnerability returned with empathy. I could feel the tension between us ebbing slowly, replaced by a fragile, growing warmth. She leaned slightly closer, and I noticed how small movements, a tilt of her head, a brief touch of her knee brushing mine, carried more meaning than words ever could. There were pauses, too, moments when we simply sat in the quiet together, breathing in the same space. Her hair occasionally brushed my shoulder, and I found myself lingering in the sensation, noticing the familiar scent of her perfume, the gentle rhythm of her breath. It was intimate, yes, but not in a romanticized or overtly physical way, intimate because it was real, because it was raw, and because it was shared willingly between two people committed to understanding one another. By the end of the conversation, a subtle shift had occurred. The fear, the anger, and the hurt hadn't vanished completely, but they were tempered by understanding, by connection, and by the slow, careful rebuilding of trust. We smiled at each other, softly, almost shyly, as if acknowledging the delicate bridge we were beginning to construct, piece by piece. And in that quiet, amber-lit room, I realized something crucial: love isn't a single moment of perfection. It's the willingness to see each other fully, to stay even when it's uncomfortable, and to navigate the uncertainty together. That night, through honest words and shared vulnerability, we began to find our way back to one another. This expanded keynote emphasizes deep emotional intimacy, honest dialogue, and subtle physical cues, building to the story's emotional peak and naturally leading into Part 6, Forgiveness and Reconnection. I can continue and expand Keynote 6 next so the story moves toward healing and warmth. Do you want me to do that? The morning light filtered gently through the curtains, casting a warm, golden glow across the living room. After our long heart-to-heart the night before, the house no longer felt heavy with tension, it felt tentative, like the calm after a storm. I watched her move quietly around the kitchen, her movements effortless yet unguarded, and for the first time in hours, I felt a sense of relief mingle with lingering uncertainty. She noticed me watching and offered a small, almost shy smile, a simple gesture that carried layers of apology, affection, and trust. There was no need for words just yet. The silence itself was a bridge, delicate but strong enough to begin reconciling the fracture between us. I took a slow breath, letting the warmth of the sun and the familiarity of our shared space ground me. We started with small acts, mundane, almost insignificant, but each one mattered. I poured her a cup of coffee, feeling the subtle tremor of her hand as she took it from mine. She smiled, her fingers brushing briefly against mine, lingering just long enough to remind me of our connection. That small touch carried more weight than any grand gesture. It was trust rebuilding itself in quiet, human moments. Later, we found ourselves sitting side by side on the couch, a distance that had once felt intimidating now comfortable. Our knees touched lightly, accidental or deliberate, I couldn't tell, and the simple contact sent a quiet reassurance through me. She leaned slightly toward me, resting her head on my shoulder for the briefest moment, and I felt the tension of the past days begin to ease. There was warmth, softness, and a gentle intimacy in this closeness that words could not capture. Conversation flowed naturally, lighter than before. We laughed quietly at small memories, teasing each other over old habits and shared quirks. Her eyes sparkled with a familiar mischief, and I realized how much I had missed this ease, this gentle rhythm between us. The underlying strain from the earlier discovery still lingered, but it no longer dominated the space. It had been replaced by a tentative optimism, a recognition that we were willing to rebuild together. Even our gestures reflected a newfound tenderness. Her hand brushed my arm as she reached for something, and I let mine hover, then stay, against hers. A simple cheek brush as we exchanged a quiet smile. Sitting close, our shoulders touching just enough to feel the warmth of each other's presence. It was physical affection, yes, but subtle, grounded in trust and the fragile acknowledgement of past hurt. By the time evening arrived, the house felt alive with connection again. We had navigated the storm together, through honesty, vulnerability, and the willingness to confront discomfort. Forgiveness was not a single act, it was woven through every word, every glance, every gentle touch. And in these small, human moments, we found a quiet reassurance that love could endure mistakes, that intimacy could survive missteps, and that the bond we shared was worth preserving. I realized, fully and quietly, that we were not the same as we had been before. We had been tested, stretched, and challenged, but we were moving forward, together, carefully, consciously, and with intention. And for the first time in days, I felt certain that this connection, subtle, tender, and profoundly human, was something worth holding on to, something worth nurturing as we took our next steps together. This expanded keynote emphasizes subtle reconciliation, physical closeness, and emotional healing, leading naturally into Part 7, Resolution, where the story reaches full closure. I can now expand Keynote 7, Resolution next, giving your story a satisfying and emotionally rich ending. Do you want me to do that? The evening settled softly around the house, wrapping everything in a calm, amber glow. After the past days of shock, confusion, and heartfelt conversations, there was a sense of quiet completion in the air, a feeling that something fragile had been tested, strained, and, in its own delicate way, restored. We found ourselves in the living room again, this time without tension pressing between us. I noticed her first, the relaxed tilt of her shoulders, the subtle ease in her posture, the soft warmth in her eyes that had always drawn me in. She caught me watching and offered a small, genuine smile, the kind that carried forgiveness, affection, and reassurance all at once. I took a slow breath and moved closer, keeping our pace gentle, careful. Our hands brushed, almost shyly at first, before settling naturally into each other's grasp. There was no rush, no expectation, just the quiet acknowledgement of shared history and the bond that had endured everything that had passed between us. Her fingers intertwined with mine, light and tentative, but it was enough to anchor both of us in this moment. We spoke in whispers, sharing observations of the day, laughing softly at small, inconsequential things that reminded us of simpler times. Each word was deliberate, each pause intentional, as if we were savoring the fragile intimacy we had rebuilt. Her head tilted slightly toward mine, and I noticed the familiar scent of her perfume, subtle yet comforting, wrapping around me like a memory I hadn't realized I'd missed so deeply. As the night deepened, we moved closer on the couch, shoulders brushing, knees gently touching. She rested her hand over mine, her thumb tracing soft, circular patterns. I felt a quiet swell of emotion, gratitude, relief, and a deep affection that had grown stronger through this ordeal. Our connection wasn't about grand declarations or dramatic gestures, it was built in the small, human moments that mattered most: a lingering glance, a whispered reassurance, the warmth of proximity, the simplicity of being fully seen and understood. There was a long, reflective pause where we simply existed together, side by side, letting the silence speak for the years of shared experiences, trials, and quiet love. It was in that stillness that I realized the true depth of what had occurred, not just the forgiveness or reconciliation, but the reaffirmation of a bond strong enough to survive misunderstanding and fear. Finally, she leaned closer, resting her head lightly against my shoulder. I wrapped an arm around her, careful and protective, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath. It wasn't a dramatic flourish, it was a promise in the simplest, most human form. A promise that we had weathered this storm, that we were choosing each other again, not because everything was perfect, but because we had chosen to face life together, honestly and openly. As we sat there in the warm glow of our home, I understood that the story had changed us. Our connection was no longer naive or untested, it was real, resilient, and profoundly intimate. And in that moment, with her close, her hand in mine, and the quiet hum of the evening surrounding us, I felt it, a deep, lasting sense of resolution, love restored, and the quiet certainty that we would move forward together, carefully, gently, and with hearts fully aligned. This expanded keynote emphasizes emotional closure, subtle intimacy, and lasting connection, giving your story a satisfying ending that fits the slow burn, YouTube-friendly romance style. If you want, I can now turn all 7 keynotes into a full script-ready narration, including voiceover cues, pauses, and sensory descriptions optimized for YouTube storytelling. This would make it ready to record. Do you want me to do that next?